Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this webinar session, Justice Delayed is Justice Denied. Daesh fighters still enjoying impunity 6 years on. My name is Evelina Ohab, and I'm the co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response. I'm joined here by Luke de Pulford, who is also a co-founder of the Coalition, and by a distinguished panel of experts that I will introduce shortly. On 3rd August 2014, Daesh launched a violent attack against the ethno-religious minority community of Yazidis in Sinjar, Iraq. Daesh fighters kill hundreds, if not thousands of men. The victims' mass graves continue to be discovered to this day. As part of the same campaign, Daesh fighters abducted boys to turn them into child soldiers and women and girls for sex slavery. In August 2020, 6 years after the abduction, thousands of women and girls are still missing. After the attack on Sinjar and over the subsequent days, Daesh attacked several villages in Nineveh Plains, forcing over 120,000 Iraqi Christians, another religious minority group in Iraq, to flee their homes to the neighboring Kurdistan. Daesh fighters took over the possessions that were left behind, burned houses, churches, and destroyed the infrastructure in the region. Daesh remained and controlled the area for approximately 2 years before the global coalition against Daesh managed to recover the areas piece by piece. The reign of Daesh in many parts of Iraq has left havoc that had to be addressed, including by military action, reconstruction of the destroyed villages, assistance to the survivors, and steps to ensure that the communities have future in the region. However, 6 years after Daesh unleashed genocide in Iraq, survivors and the families of the victims are still waiting for justice being served. Some Daesh fighters have been prosecuted for the atrocities in Iraq and other countries. While the number of prosecutions is very small, even those proceedings cannot be regarded as unproblematic, especially in Iraq. The challenges can be summarized as the prosecutions being conducted predominantly for less severe offences only, and often conducted without due process and in violation of the rule of law. Furthermore, survivors are not involved in the process and so deprived of their day in court. And as evidence of the Daesh atrocities is being collected, it is crucial to consider how Daesh fighters can be brought to account for their role, for their involvement in the genocide against religious minorities in the region, to ensure that survivors and the families of the victims will see justice being done. Today, you will hear from Lord Alton of Liverpool, here at the UK House of Lords and patron of the Coalition for Genocide Response. You will also hear from Abid Shamdin, Executive Director of Nadia's Initiative, Sareta Asraf, barrister specialized in international criminal, humanitarian and human rights law, and Peter Omtzig, Dutch MP and Rapporteur on bringing Daesh to justice at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. This will be followed by a short section on for questions and answers. This session is being recorded and the recording will be available from the Coalition website. And now we'll hear a short message from Lord Alton of Liverpool.
Ever since the first reports of Daesh atrocities emerged, I have frequently raised the unending suffering and plight of Yazidis and Christians in northern Iraq. A few months ago, I was able to go and see for myself the situation, and I met with survivors, including the Baba Sheikh, the spiritual leader of the Yazidis, and with Christians who had fled Mosul as ISIS attacked. Again and again, through questions and interventions in Parliament, I've specifically called upon Her Majesty's government to name the atrocities for what they are, genocide, the crime above all crimes, and to act, to prevent, to suppress, and to punish that crime. Name and act. These are the two crucial steps which need to be taken to deliver justice for the victims and survivors, justice that continues to be delayed. And as William Ewart Gladstone famously once said, justice delayed is justice denied. Disgracefully, even in a country like the United Kingdom, which celebrates the rule of law, justice continues to be denied here too. One of the reasons for this is that, as it stands, our government does not have any formal mechanism which allows for the consideration and recognition of mass atrocities that meet the threshold of genocide as defined by Article 2 of the 1948 Convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, the Genocide Convention. As a result, our government are at a disadvantage when trying to fulfill their duties to protect, prevent, and punish. Perhaps it's a disadvantage which suits some. The lack of a formal mechanism, whether grounded in law or policy, was criticised by the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee in its December 2017 report. However, until this day, there has been no change. And that is why I introduced the Genocide Determination Bill in the House of Lords. It seeks to address the lack of a formal mechanism to make the determination of genocide. It would invest the High Court of England and Wales, not politicians, with the power to make a preliminary finding in cases of alleged genocide, and subsequently to refer such findings to the International Criminal Court or a special tribunal, which wouldn't necessarily be dependent on the Security Council. The proposal responds to the argument of the UK government that the determination of genocide should be made by a competent court. So in the bill, the competent court is the High Court, not an international court. And the bill also recognises that under the Genocide Convention, it is the duty of the state, not international institutions, to act. Her Majesty's government will argue that the genocide determination is not crucial, but that actions to address mass atrocities are. But actions and words are strongly connected. Gregory H. Stanton, research professor in genocide studies and prevention at George Mason University, said that research reveals, and these are his words, choice of the term to be used is determined by willingness to take action to stop the killing. When the terms ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity were used, it indicated unwillingness to take forceful action to stop the crimes. So, when we hesitate to name genocide for what it has lethal and horrific consequences, and it makes a mockery of the oft-repeated mantra about preventing these things from ever happening again. The government's reliance on international judicial systems is flawed because parties to the Genocide Convention are duty bearers under the Genocide Convention, not the international judicial systems. Parties to the Genocide Convention, such as the UK, must act to ensure that the determination is made by a competent body in accordance with the law and policy of the state, to inform its response and to act to prevent and punish the crime. In 2017, through Resolution 2379, the United Kingdom successfully persuaded the Security Council to collect evidence of these appalling crimes and of mass graves. And the Foreign and Commonwealth Office deserves credit for that. But the Security Council has failed to establish a mechanism to create ad hoc tribunals to try those responsible. We should now work with our allies, if necessary outside of the Security Council, to create such a mechanism. What is the point of collecting evidence if we don't then do anything about it? The alternative, of course, is to allow mass murderers to grow old unpunished. 6 years after the attack on Sinjar and other regions of Iraq, it is time for the government to reconsider their long-standing policy on genocide determination and to look at new approaches to ensure that they are fully equipped to fulfill their obligations under the Convention to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. And then, by doing that, they would fill this gaping lacuna. I hope that today's colloquialism will contribute to bringing an end to this endless cycle of crime after crime, genocide after genocide. I hope that the colloquialism will help to bridge that gap.
Now I'll give the floor to Abid Shamdeen, Executive Director of Nadia's Initiative and tireless advocate for the Yazidi people. Abid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alina, and thank you so much for having me today and for providing that detailed overview of what happened to Yazidis. So I will, in the sake of saving time, I will try to quickly go over that overview. As we all know, when ISIS attacked killing thousands of Yazidis on August 3rd and enslaving thousands of Yazidi women and children. That was not everything they did. It was a systematic campaign of destruction against the Yazidi community, and the genocide being recognized by the UN and some other countries. It was for a reason, because when ISIS came, they came to destroy and eradicate the Yazidi community from that region, using women and children as weapons against the Yazidi community to destroy the very fabric of this community, and to use those women to fuel their war in Syria and Iraq, selling these women and offering them to ISIS fighters. Today, 6 years after, on the 6th anniversary of the Yazidi genocide, we can see that over 80 mass graves have been discovered in Sinjar region only. We have thousands of survivors who survived sexual violence, and children as well, mostly on their own, without collective action from the international community, from our government, from KRG, to create a task force to rescue these women and children from sexual slavery. Today, the Yazidi community remains displaced. The homeland remains destroyed, and Yazidis are not any closer to justice than they were 6 years ago, because the fact is, what has been done, what we can say is that what has been done, and so far, creation of UNITAD through the UN Security Council resolution is basically all that has been done, and UNITAD's work continues to collect evidence, even though the process is slow due to the bureaucracy in Iraq and many other complications. This evidence, as the previous speaker mentioned, if it's not being used in a court of law, what is the point of collecting this evidence? And the fact is, today we are not any closer to justice for Yazidis, because no determination has been made as to create a tribunal to use this evidence. This evidence should have already been used, and UNITAD should be feeding this evidence to a court. Yazidi survivors have come forward. Thousands, in fact, of survivors have provided and are ready to provide their testimonies. Some, in the case of survivors of sexual violence, have publicly spoke about their stories. But we know, and this has been said, ISIS committed crimes against other communities. This is true, but the Yazidi case is very unique because ISIS was public about everything they did against Yazidis. There is overwhelming public evidence, videos, and they used chat rooms and published material about selling and buying Yazidi women online, and it's happening today as we speak. Over 2,800 Yazidi women and children are still missing in captivity. We know most of them are in Syria. There are a number of them are actually in Iraq as well. So there is no excuse about why we don't start the process of delivering justice for Yazidis. Justice delayed as justice denied is the perfect match for the case of Yazidis, and this is exactly what is happening to Yazidis. How can you expect survivors of sexual violence, these children that were brainwashed, the majority or the entire Yazidi population in Iraq that was forced to this place to heal and restore their lives without seeing justice? And when I say justice, not only in terms of justice in a court of law, yet that should be the first step, and that should be the most important step, and it is for at least for all the Yazidis that that I've interacted with, especially the survivors. The livelihoods of Yazidis were destroyed. Our temples, our schools. Yazidis lost almost everything they had in a matter of hours. And that part of the justice for Yazidi has also not been delivered in terms of reparations for these survivors, for people that lost their livelihoods, in terms of formal recognition by the Iraqi government that this was in fact a genocide against Yazidis. It is shameful, I believe, for the Iraqi government that other countries in some parliaments have recognized the Yazidi genocide, but the Iraqi government has failed to do so. These are their own citizens that they failed to protect from this genocide. 2 years ago, Nadia and other Yazidis urged the Iraqi government, the Speaker of the Parliament, the President, to pass the law about Yazidi survivors of sexual genocide, sexual slavery. This law has been sitting at the Iraqi Parliament for nearly a year and a half, I believe, without even bringing this legislation for a vote. This is unacceptable on the part of Iraq. When we come to the part about the international community, as the previous speaker noted, there are parties to the International Convention on Genocide, including European countries. Their citizens committed sexual violence against Yazidi women and crimes against Yazidi women in genocide. That these countries should be taking steps and not wait for Iraq, for a government that is dysfunctional, a judicial system that is dysfunctional. Some of these countries, including Europeans, have moral responsibility. And if they want to establish deterrence, and if they want to, if they mean what they say about never again and no to impunity, they ought to be putting their words into action and taking the necessary steps to actually deliver justice for Yazidis. I believe only Germany, France, Netherlands, and maybe one more country have taken some steps to prosecute their nationals whom were involved in the genocide against Yazidis. But that is far from enough that Europeans should be doing. The other part is that, part of justice for the Yazidis, and especially the women and children, if we are not seeing collective effort from the Iraqi government, a process that is in place to actually rescue these women and help them recover from what they have endured in the past 6 years. The international community should have used the coalition to defeat ISIS and established a task force to actually work with the Iraqis and local forces in their region to search and rescue these women and children. I think so far what's happening is unacceptable, and it's not establishing deterrence to, and is not going to send the right message to groups like ISIS with genocidal intention, that they shouldn't be doing this, because if they do, they will be held accountable. And now, with overwhelming public evidence from ISIS themselves, and with overwhelming legal evidence being collected by UNITAD and others, it's a big failure to delay and deny justice to Yazidi survivors of genocide, and especially survivors of sexual violence. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Abid, for your presentation. And I think you asked a very important question. What kind of message are we sending to perpetrators as Daesh fighters? And the message that I keep having in mind is that you can get away with genocide. That's the precise message that we are sending right now. And now I would like to give the floor to Sarefa, and already mentioned that Sarita is a barrister specialized in international criminal, humanitarian, and human rights law. And Sarita has a very unique experience on engaging with the issue of Daesh atrocities, since she's been working with the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on Syria, and also UNITAD. So of course, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us. Sarita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. As has just been said, I started my work in relation to Daesh crimes in northern Iraq and in the Nineveh region in particular in late 2014. Can you hear me all right? In late 2014, focusing largely on the Yazidis, and then went on to write the report They Came to Destroy, which was published in June of 2016, which made the determination that ISIS was committing the crime of genocide and multiple crimes against humanity. In this presentation today, I am going to center so many of the remarks on the Yazidis, but when it comes to the question of justice, I am going to expand those to also other ethno-religious communities in Iraq, which are also facing distinct paucity of justice in relation to the crimes committed against them. During the COVID-19 pandemic, where we are witnessing a resurgence of attacks by ISIS and in areas around Sinjar and the Nineveh Plains and in other areas of Iraq, notably in Diyala and Salahuddin, we're confronted by the reality that despite the passage of 6 years, we have not seen considerable improvements in the pursuit of accountability for Daesh crimes. Everyone who works on these issues are very humbled by the reality that there are still many women and girls, especially from the Yazidi community, who are missing and whose fate and whereabouts continue to be unknown. It's a matter which is highly traumatic for the Yazidi community. We also recognize the needs of those who've been displaced, tens of thousands of whom remain living in camps, many of them in tented camps in the same tents that they entered into 6 years ago. Their needs remain quite dire. I want to speak first about some of the current challenges. So since we're at the threshold of the we've just gone past the 6th anniversary. The first is that all the communities that are based in camps, Yazidi and non-Yazidi, and I hear thinking specifically about some of the camps housing Christians around Erbil, face tremendous challenges in terms of access to employment, access to education, and simply a healthy environment for children living in, particularly children in the camps, as well as those who've suffered physical and sexual violence and who bear signs of psychological trauma. The availability of psychosocial support in the camps is dwarfed by the need for it in the camps, and that is particularly with regard to specific groups. Among those groups, I would say, are children. There's a definite lack of appropriate psychological care available to children, and particularly children who have either been, in the case of boys, indoctrinated, forcibly recruited, and made to fight in Daesh forces, as well as younger girls who have been forced into the system of sexual enslavement or suffered other forms of physical violence, for example, during forced servitude in ISIL fighters' houses. Within every marginalized community, there are also groups which suffer greater marginalization, and we see that in the provision of resources for psychosocial support. The Yazidi community faces particular challenges, some of which could have serious risks in the future. This is particularly so in the case of indoctrinated children and in some cases women. In 2019, we saw a higher rate of return for people who had been held in baghouz, as well as people who had Yazidi, when I say people, Yazidi, mainly women and children who had been in baghouz, but also those who are still being identified and taken out of Al-Hul camp in eastern Syria. For many of these people, they have been with Daesh for the entirety duration from 2014 to the present day, and have also been subjected to the airstrikes and attacks which led to the collapse of Daesh's territorial control. For some of these instances, you have high rates of indoctrination and trauma. It's been very difficult for the Yazidi community to cope with these with individuals within their midst who suffer this level of indoctrination. In some instances, families have had to be moved from the camps because of both the protection of the indoctrinated individuals and the protection of their own family members, with some instances of former child soldiers now seeing their own families as infidels. Even if our indoctrination is not necessarily a quotient of a problem. You have an institute with many children no longer speak Kurmanji Kurdish, their mother tongue. Some only speak Arabic or potentially Russian, German, or English, depending on whether they were housed with foreign fighters or not. So it creates incredibly great challenges within the community of bringing them back in, simply because there's little grounds for little ability to communicate within people who've been taken. I do want to turn briefly, before focusing on justice, into the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, because it's the access to the camps is obviously being curtailed. That is a wise move given the lack of medical care infrastructure available to people in the camps, and the inability, for example, to social distance and in some cases engage in regular hand washing. However, what we've seen is that there's been much higher rates of suicidal thoughts and trauma. In 2015, there was a survey done in cities like Sinjar, which determined that 55% of the core population suffered from depression and 63% suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. As a result of COVID-19, a more recent study has indicated that has now increased by 20%, with an increase in suicidal thoughts, including and with a particular impact on males. Reporting an increase of suicidal thoughts. As a result of the pandemic, there's just been less access of the community to medical care, and also, of course, also to education. This is particular impacts on young children who are already poorly served by psychosocial support and who had already been removed from school as a result of falling into Daesh captivity and making their way back to the camps and living as members of the displaced community. So COVID-19 is going to have tremendous impacts on these Yazidis and other marginalized groups in any event, but particularly on people suffering trauma, and within the community of those suffering trauma, particularly children who also will be challenged by not being able to attend school. Within the community of children, that is also likely to fall most heavily the impact on female children, young female children, putting them at risk of early marriages, and also moving them into doing more work within the home rather than necessarily being prioritized for education. I do want to turn to the issue of justice. As everyone said, there was a complete failure in the early years of the documentation and documentation work with the Yazidi community in particular, of managing expectations. And everyone from journalists to those doing documentation were really keen on emphasizing the role justice had to play in a number of different outcomes, including combating a culture of impunity, including health outcomes, mental health outcomes in the Yazidi community. I think what there wasn't enough focus on was ensuring that people understood how long the arc of justice can and often does take. As a result, the one question we do get from the Yazidis most frequently, aside from how are we going to locate missing persons, is why is this taking so long? Why is for example, justice being delayed? In the last year, there have been some steps forward, not enough steps forward for anyone to be satisfied, but nevertheless, there has been some movement. Part of that has coincided with the entrenching of UNITAD, which is the UN investigative team to promote accountability for the crimes committed by Daesh, which was established through UN Security Council resolution in 2017. They have now become entrenched on the ground and are working quite significantly in building collaboration with Iraqi authorities. That includes the excavation of mass graves in Kocho and in Solar, and soon hopefully outside of the Sinjar region as well. But also they have been looking at working with Iraqi authorities to identify detainees already in custody and to start building cases against them. One of the big blocks to justice inside Iraq is the fact there is no mass atrocity legislation in Iraq. The state of the Iraqi parliament, as Abid alluded to, is not such that we can necessarily rely on mass atrocity legislation, even if it were presented to the parliament to be passed at any time soon. There is an opportunity potentially to reinvigorate the Iraqi High Tribunal, which is a very controversial body that handled the Ba'athist trials post the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. It doesn't have a particularly good reputation, I would say, amongst those of us who are focused on international criminal law. Nevertheless, it would provide an opening for potentially being able to charge detainees with mass atrocity crimes, among them genocide and crimes against humanity. To date, there have been multiple cases of prosecutions of suspected members and collaborators of ISIS in the Iraqi courts, but these have only taken place under the anti-terror laws of 2005, which criminalizes membership of an association with the group. I myself attended a few trials in Khark Court in northern Baghdad, and saw in some cases where ISIS fighters, maybe foreign fighters, were attempting to explain what had brought them there. And in their explanations, they were given, which to a criminal lawyer would have been quite interesting information around command structures and linkage. But for the purposes of a trial, an anti-terrorism trial, that information wasn't necessarily relevant, and so was being lost in the shuffle of these very short and quite concerning trials. I do want to point out that in Germany, the Office of the Federal Public Prosecutor has been conducting a structural investigation for some years, I think since shortly after the attack. And in the last year, 2 arrest warrants against high-level suspects for their alleged involvement in the genocide of the Yazidis have been issued, and there are 2 trials ongoing in Germany at this time. Finally, I just want to close with the fact that it is, at the moment, it is true, and I think fairly uncontroversial to say, that the focus of accountability for ISIS crimes has largely been focused on crimes against the Yazidis. The understanding of crimes against other communities, such as the Kakai, the Shabak, the Shia Turkmen, and to a lesser extent the Christian communities, have not necessarily been highlighted as much in accountability conversations. That also has an impact on justice, because it threads down to what funding then becomes available for documentation and analysis and case building. And also the training and organizational support given to those communities for their organizations, such as for the Yazidis which exist, such as the Asda and Free Yazidi Foundation. We don't necessarily see that same level of let's say mature development of other organizations for other groups, which again has an impact on justice. So we're still waiting to see a real understanding of what crimes ISIS committed, for example, against the Shia community and Shabak and Kakai community. And there needs to be more work done with those communities and more work with survivor communities. I just want to close by saying that over time in Iraq, and well, globally, but speaking particularly about Iraq now, we have seen a higher tolerance for violence against groups which have been marginalized, and that includes many of the ethno-religious minorities in Iraq. Today, we still see discriminatory attitudes against many of these groups, and notably the Yazidis. And in the case of the Yazidis, non-acceptance of the Yazidi people and Yazidis' cultures, and a continual misreading of the faith. So when we're speaking about justice, we are, of course, looking backwards. But one of the questions that we should ask about Iraq is Iraq is it past atrocities? Where are we in the cycle of atrocities in Iraq? And can we really firmly say that we are looking backwards at justice without also looking forward and discussing how we preventing risk from moving forward? Justice has a really important role to play in preventing future atrocities. But ultimately, if we are not tackling the kind of ingrained prejudices against other smaller ethno-religious communities in Iraq, including but certainly not limited to the Yazidis, we're putting them and continuing to put them at risk, not only of a resurgent ISIS, but of future groups or future incarnations of terror in Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sareta, for the great overview, and also for identifying some of the ongoing challenges. And that ultimately mean that the religious minorities that once faced genocide at the hands of Daesh are still not safe, and their future is really in danger if we don't address those other issues as well. So thank you very much for that. And now I would like to give the floor to Peter Omtzig, a Dutch parliamentarian and former special rapporteur on bringing Daesh to justice at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And sorry, I'm not feeling very well, but I hope you can hear me well. I'll discuss 3 topics. First, the topic of what has been done in the Netherlands. Secondly, the topic of what we asked from the International Criminal Court. And thirdly, my ongoing work as rapporteur. I have my mandate has been renewed.
I need to get my plug.
Sorry? Okay. In the Netherlands, I've pushed hard to have the genocide by the ISIS fighters recognized. And in small steps, the Dutch government thinks it's highly likely that ISIS, Daesh, committed genocides on Yazidi and other minority groups. That, as Lord Elton says, means that under the Genocide Convention, the Dutch government is obliged, and I recall, obliged to prosecute Daesh fighters. The interesting thing about Daesh fighters, in my view, is that we've got thousands of Daesh fighters coming from countries like Great Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and other Western countries, but also countries like Russia, who are also a member of the Council of Europe, who are thus obliged to start prosecuting them at home. And that is only happening piecemeal-wise. I even believe that, for instance, under Dutch law, you can prosecute them from being a member of an organization that committed genocide. Because as speakers before me said, Daesh is quite different from other genocidal organizations in that in magazines like The Beak, they were pretty explicit on wanting to commit genocide, and they're actually putting forward their arguments why genocide, in their view, was okay on Yazidis and to a lesser extent to Christians. Usually, if you go to the 10 steps approach, the one thing you do about genocide is to be silent about what you're doing. Daesh is being anything but silent about its intentions. That should make prosecution a whole lot easier than other prosecutions. Meeting the bar of genocide should not be too difficult. Together with Evelina, Lord Elton, also other MPs, we went to the International Criminal Court and actually asked them to prosecute. We handed in the evidence. The evidence was the evidence provided by Daesh itself. The magazines that big, the names of these fighters to start prosecuting. They seem to be very unwilling. And obviously internationally there is something of a difficulty. For anything that happened in Syria, there is a difficulty that Syria had never joined the Rome Convention, and obviously is unlikely and unwilling to do so. And at least 2 members of the Security Council are unwilling to refer the situation to the ICC as at the moment. Still, the ICC could intervene for fighters which are nationals of countries which did sign the Convention of Rome. And as I told you earlier, there are quite a few countries which signed the Convention of Rome and have hundreds of fighters there. That's not only a legal opportunity, it's also a thing to be ashamed of, that our countries permitted these people to join a genocidal organization. To give you the example, my own Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, publicly said that he would rather have those people go and die there than to stay in the Netherlands. I was appalled by that because I know that a number of them were indeed killed, but the other people were taking part in genocide. If any other country would say, well, we wouldn't mind our citizens to travel to the Netherlands and commit genocide there, we would be outraged. And I think Iraq and Syria had any reason to be outraged against the Netherlands and other Western countries not stopping their fighters from going there. Now they're back. I think our countries should prosecute these people. And that's even if I wouldn't care about any Yazidi, even if I wouldn't care about any Christian there, these people are dangerous to the extreme. They have been, and not only the men, also the women, if you look at it, they have been in a system which considers it okay to have an Untermensch. It considers it okay to kill the other. So even if we only care about our own safety, we should be very much aware of what we're doing. And obviously, we should be aware that in the interest of international genocide prevention only happens if you manage to punish the perpetrators of the last genocide. And this is the last genocide. So we should take a real aim at punishing these people. Now, in the Council of Europe, of which 47 European countries are a member, basically every European country bar Belarus, we recognized, when I proposed it in 2016, that Daesh committed genocide, which parliamentarians from 47 nations is not a small feat. You can happily refer to that. Then I came with my report, and part of my report in 2018 was to point out how many fighters were coming from where, who was doing what. Basically, no one was doing a lot, and they were coming from many countries. And we put in a proposal for a sort of hybrid international tribunal, which would be a sort of workaround. I think that's still a very valid proposal, but I'm open to any proposal to prosecute these people. Now, in the Council of Europe, since little progress has been made, I made the proposal to have a new investigation. We started that. Now, the work has been a little bit delayed because of COVID-19. I can't go to Strasbourg, can't visit the camps at the moment. And seeing what all those particular European countries have done to prosecute their own Daesh fighters, and whether we can see whether we can have some international initiative to have a court of some kind, or coordination of some kind, to preserve the evidence and to make sure that these Daesh fighters are convicted and are convicted for genocide. If you want to join that work, please let me know by the end of this conversation. Thank you, Evelina.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Peter, for your great overview. And just following up on a few of the issues that Peter mentioned, the report from 2018 and the research that was conducted towards that report, that was one of the largest pieces of research done in relation to how the different member states to the Council of Europe have been responding to the Daesh atrocities and what they've been doing in relation to the foreign fighters. And of course, this research is available online on the website of the Council of Europe as linked to that report. And of course, it emphasizes that there have been only few prosecutions of Daesh fighters who returned back to their home countries, and that was mostly on terror-related offences. But of course, that research was from back in 2018, and there've been a little bit of progress. And Abid and Sareta already mentioned as well that there've been, well, in the whole world, one prosecution of Daesh fighter for genocide, and that is in Germany. But it's only one case like that currently. And of course, and Peter just sent a link, and I will send it to all attendees as well. That's a link to his report. And Peter mentioned also that he continues his mandate as the special rapporteur, and at least in the motion for resolution that was tabled by Peter, Peter wishes to continue this inquiry into how the different member states to the Council of Europe have been prosecuting Daesh over the last 2 years since the last report from 2018. So we all, of course, we look forward to see the results of that research and that report, hopefully over the next months or maybe 2021. Let's hope. There's a lot of work that has to go into such reports. And now I would like to open the floor to questions. And I already see that Baroness Cox, who is here with us, sent a question in relation to the situation of Yazidis in Syria. And the question is, what can we do to assist Yazidis suffering in Syria? And if Abid could maybe comment in relation to any kind of work that you've been doing on the situation of Yazidis in Syria. You already mentioned that, of course, the majority of the women that were abducted, women and girls abducted from Sinjar, are presumably in Syria right now. And of course, there is a great need to rescue them. But of course, the Yazidi community in Syria is also suffering, is also subjected to persecution. So if you have any comments in relation to that, that would be much appreciated.
Yes, thank you. Well, so yes, we know for a fact that the majority of those that are still missing are in Syria. Most of them in territories where radical groups are affiliated with Turkey and others. Often every week or so, 1 or 2 Yazidi women and children are being rescued. You know, these are being trafficked. You know, their families whom were forced to flee their homes and have been displaced in the same tents as Sarita mentioned for the past 6 years have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to be able to recover their family members. And we know some of them are also in Al-Hol camp, where they have all these ISIS family grouped in there, including some of the women, as you know, Peter mentioned, I believe, they're also dangerous. They're brainwashing these children and and women, and they're afraid to come forward and say we're Yazidis. They don't know what's going on. They live in that camp, disconnected from the world. And as I mentioned, one of the main problems is that there is no collective effort to rescue them. For someone to go to Syria, for example, we have put forward a request to the Iraqi government to allow a group of Yazidis that we can sponsor to go and look for these women and children, at least in these camps, but they have refused to give permission. And the international coalition is not doing anything regarding this specific issue. As in regards to the Yazidis in Afrin and other places, some of their religious sites have been destroyed. Radical groups affiliated with Turkey are taking over a lot of the regions that inhabit Yazidis. Many Yazidis have been forced to leave their areas, and you know, as a group, we don't have any access to those regions in Syria, and but we continue to advocate for them. And I think NATO ought to be doing something to make sure that these radical Islamist groups are not committing ethnic cleansing against Yazidis and Kurds in these areas.
Thank you very much, Abid. And I do have a question here to Sareta, and the question is, could you please comment more about the important judgment that is happening in Germany? And I presume the reference here to the genocide case.
Yes, I should say we're not at the judgment stage yet. Essentially, the path to international criminal justice is blocked at an international level for the Yazidis. And so the importance of national trials to the international criminal justice experiment has really continued to deepen. In Germany, we're seeing both universal jurisdiction cases and active jurisdiction cases in the cases of German foreign fighters who've returned home. In the cases that are in Germany, one case, the case of Taha A, who's the husband, and Jennifer W, who was the wife, although I think they're being tried separately, involves the causing the death of a young Yazidi girl who was held in domestic servitude. She was 5 years old, who was being punished inside the house and was left out in the sun without water, where she eventually died. Her mother was enslaved by the husband of Taha A, and is also given evidence in Germany. And so so just in respect of the German cases, we've seen a real a sense of a very active approach by the Office of the German Federal Prosecutor when it comes to the Yazidis, and increased outreach to the Yazidi community, but the cases are still very, very few and far between, and we don't know, to be honest, what the judgment will be at this time.
Thank you very much, Sareta. And just a follow-up question on that, if that's okay. There's a question, how has Germany been able to prosecute Daesh fighters for genocide specifically, and can this legal process be replicated in other countries? And you briefly mentioned the universal jurisdiction, but if you could just maybe briefly comment on that.
Sure. So first of all, Germany has the laws around mass atrocity legislation in their domestic law. That differs them from many countries. Some countries still don't have, for example, genocide or crimes against humanity is a crime in domestic law. In Germany, particularly Germany and Sweden, they have the purest forms of universal jurisdiction, which means they're allowed to investigate, indict, and prosecute. Investigate and indict people who have committed crimes where there's no link to Germany, the crime is not committed in Germany, the perpetrator is not in Germany, and the victim is not necessarily in Germany, and that's in Sweden and Norway. However, you can't have trials in absentia in Germany. So while they can do the investigation and can bring investigation all the way up to the point of indictment, the actual process of prosecution and trial cannot start unless that person is physically in custody in Germany. So yes, we see the issue of universal jurisdiction has always been a little bit challenging because it's incredibly useful for these particular cases, but it's obviously something that would be used more broadly. And so there are obviously political pushbacks about potentially allowing any government, any member of any entity and particularly I spoke to senior members of government who perhaps are allied with Germany, who people might want to bring forward on universal jurisdiction charges. But certainly we expect to see more cases and greater use of universal jurisdiction. And to the extent that it is possible to have purer forms of universal jurisdiction, more liberal forms of universal jurisdiction, it obviously is a particular help when it comes to charging foreign fighters where active personality jurisdiction and passive personality jurisdiction are not options.
Thank you very much, Sareta. And just a couple of days ago, on the 3rd of August, during a conference at the UN, Amal Clooney mentioned that she identified 4 different ways how to prosecute Daesh for the involvement in genocide. And of course, there've been no movements, and there've been no political will, it appears, to proceed with one of those options. And the question would be to all panelists, what, in your opinion, should be the approach to prosecuting Daesh fighters? Should that be an ad hoc tribunal? Should that be, of course, maybe the ICC at least prosecuting the foreign fighters? What is the approach that you would propose, or in your advocacy you are proposing to deal with Daesh atrocities? If Abid, if you'd like to maybe comment upon it.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly not a legal lawyer, so I don't want to jump ahead of myself and make comments on that. But you know what we have seen is that, you know, what we've heard from survivors and Yazidis is that they want to make sure that these trials are being conducted publicly, 1, 2, under some sort of international observation and participation. As I mentioned, the Iraqi judicial system is not, you know, they don't have the capacity to do these trials. At the moment, most, I would say, Sarita might, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, most, if not all, of the trials in Iraq that have been done so far involve broad terrorism charges, you know, membership to IS in Al-Qaeda and so forth. There is no specific mention of genocide against Yazidis, no specific mention of sexual violence, even though, like I said, these were public, you know, on their Dabiq magazine, like Peter mentioned, and on their online propaganda, they advertised the selling and the buying of Yazidi women and children. So they have failed, the judicial system in Iraq have failed to mention these specific crimes against Yazidis, and this is why we believe that some sort of international body should be involved. On the other hand, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of European nationals and foreign fighters who were also involved in these crimes against Yazidis. And I don't see why a lot of these countries don't agree and don't put forward a plan together to prosecute all these their nationals. And last I heard from Iraqi authorities, they have 800 European, mostly nationals, in custody that they have no idea what they're going to do with, and the Europeans are not taking their nationals and prosecuting them. In some cases, you know, we don't know what's going to happen to these IS members who've committed these crimes against Yazidis. Will they be bailed out and where you have a corrupt system in Iraq and buy their way out of prison and escape from accountability? That's highly possible.
Thank you very much, Abid. And if I could give the floor to Sareta to maybe just from the perspective of working with UNITAD and of course the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on Syria. So you've seen a lot of evidence being collected already, and especially following the UN Security Council Resolution 2379, could we then replicate the approach taken by the UN Security Council to Bosnia and Rwanda, and having the first mechanism already established, collecting the evidence, could we then proceed with another UN Security Council resolution establishing an ad hoc tribunal to prosecute Daesh for its crimes in Iraq?
Well, to answer, to first start the question, yes, just to first kind of seat the question. I mean, I really see the UN Security Council resolutions, both the one which set up UNITAD as well as the General Assembly resolution which set up the IIIM for Syria, as being obviously innovations, but really a result of political failures. Because had there been a political willingness and a willingness to come over blocks, and specifically, for example, the use of veto in the Security Council, you could have moved these cases directly towards, for example, the ICC. It could have been referred to the ICC, and then you wouldn't have had to set up this kind of interim entity between the ground and national what will now almost inevitably be national jurisdiction cases. So yes, you could have an ad hoc tribunal. In theory, if you could get the Security Council to vote for it without exercising their veto, which is much more possible in the case of ad hoc tribunal than ICC referral, but still I think quite challenging. Challenging to make reality. In the case of the Swedish suggestion, that really came out of not necessarily a desire to prosecute people for international crimes committed against ethno-religious minorities. It came out of wanting to ensure that foreign fighters didn't have to be repatriated and then tried in Sweden. So there would essentially be some unit out there that would do these prosecutions, principally so Sweden and potentially other European countries wouldn't have to. I do think that the idea of the ad hoc tribunal is interesting. I think it's a little bit far-flung, and for me, what I would really like to see is greater pressure on national jurisdictions, one, to enact laws that allow for those trials to take place, criminal trials rather than anti-terror trials, and two, that there's a greater sense of responsibility amongst states that do have their nationals and children of their nationals in predominantly in eastern Syria, some in Iraq, to start repatriating them and prosecuting them in their home countries. I'm a little bit dismayed at the attitude towards the foreign fighters and ISIS-associated families, because they're not being prosecuted in Europe, I don't think it falls to the Syrian Kurds to sit and figure out what to do with them. And it's an untenable situation which cannot continue to go on for much longer, particularly given the precarious nature of what's happening in northern Syria with some of the Turkish incursions.
Thank you very much, Sareta. And just the same question, I would just reshape it slightly for Peter. And of course, the Netherlands was one of the countries that supported Sweden, and I think Germany, trying to propose some kind of ad hoc tribunal. Is there political will in the Netherlands to continue with this proposal? Because there have been no updates for the last, I think, over a year, so there's been no progress there.
Well, I certainly would make sure that there is a political will. There is in my party, and I believe there is in other political parties as well. I think the Dutch government lost, at least I wanted our Minister of Foreign Affairs to have been a bit active when we were a member of the UN Security Council for 1 year. He didn't really put any concrete proposal on the table then. I pushed him long and hard what he didn't want to, because he was afraid of it being voted down. And I was less afraid of it being voted down, because if it had been voted down, at least it would have been clear who was voting it down in a Security Council. But if there is, that's one of the reasons I'm participating here. If there's any interesting coalition to be built of other nations who want to pick it up again, I'll make sure that will be part of it.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I see that we are running out of time, so unfortunately we'll have to conclude here. But I would give the floor now to Luke to conclude this session. Luke, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Evelina. Look, I think, as ever, Lord Alton provided a crystal clear diagnosis of the problem. No genocide recognition means no justice. And I think all of our panelists underscored this. Unfortunately, I think in these 6 years, enough time has passed for people to have forgotten the extent of Daesh's depravities against Yazidis and other ethno-religious minorities. I think over the last few days, many of us have been reminded the social media campaigns run by various Yazidi institutions and activists connected to this anniversary has been again putting before us truly brutal reminders in the form of the extremely disturbing videos and photographs with which we're all so familiar. But as Abid and Sareta reminded us, the suffering continues. It is abject suffering, and it finds expression in the conditions of the IDP camps, in the mental health of survivors, in the continuing brainwashing, and in the persistent denial of justice. This is really why we set up the Coalition for Genocide Response, to confront what we've all spoken about here, the problem of genocide recognition. It won't have passed people by on this call that, having manifestly failed to name and act upon the Yazidi genocide, the international community is now facing another instance of suspected genocide, another genocide denial right now regarding the treatment of Uyghurs in northwest China. As with the Yazidi genocide, geopolitics is likely to prevent a determination of genocide through the usual channels. Look, we normally like to end these calls with something positive and with something concrete people can do. And it's very hard to feel positive today. One thing I think we can all do is take some comfort from the fact that there is now, I believe, growing momentum and impatience with the inertia of the international community among politicians all over the world on this issue. And I believe that we can capitalize on that if we work together. People are rightly angry, and we should channel that anger. Certainly in the UK, I think we've seen more political interest around this issue of genocide recognition than ever before in the last few weeks. So I think that if your organization or you wishes to join this Coalition for Genocide Response, which is really a voluntary endeavor on Evelina and my part, together with a wonderful group of very active patrons, your help will be very much appreciated and is very much needed. So it just remains for me to thank all of our panelists, Lord Alton in absentia, Abid Shalim, Sareta Ashraf, and Peter Omsig, MP. And lastly, thank you, Evelina, who does so much to facilitate these important discussions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much to everyone. Stay safe and speak to you soon. Bye-bye.